Hello, BookTube, and welcome to our first read-along of April. This is Anthony Trollope's 1874 novel, Phineas Redux. It's the fourth novel in his Palliser series, his parliamentary novels. They're sometimes his political novels that more or less closely, sometimes more, sometimes less, follows political themes through 6 books. And this is, as you can tell from the title, a direct continuation of the second of the Palliser novels, which was called Phineas Finn, which we read. We did a read-along on this channel. That book followed the introduction to politics of a young, handsome, charming Irishman named Phineas Finn, who, with a little bit of money and a whole lot of luck, manages to launch himself in London politics, manages to become a member of Parliament. And at the same time that he's doing that, he is doing what we suspect he does better than anything else, which is to ingratiate himself to women. Several characters in Phineas Finn remark on this talent of his. He's charming, he's affable, he's self-deprecating, he's not threatening, he's extremely good-looking, and through a combination of those things, and also because we're given to believe in Phineas Finn that the political women of London like having their pet projects, even their pets. One of those is Lady Glencora Palliser, the wife of Plantagenet Palliser, who's in the Exchequer and is a rising man in Parliament, and who has far more political instinct and political hunger than he does. There's also Lady Laura Standish, who is, according to her lights, forced to marry for money. She has a deep affection for Phineas Finn, what she calls in that book and in this one, deep love. I doubt that myself, and I wonder if a lot of you will doubt it too, but one way or another, she believes it. And she decides that she must marry money in order to succeed in the world. So she marries a man named Robert Kennedy, who in Phineas Finn seems like bedrock. Every bit as solid as bedrock and every bit as boring as bedrock. He's incredibly wealthy, has an opulent spread in Scotland. But he's not anything that would ever excite Lady Laura, who is now Laura Kennedy. He also befriends and is befriended by Violet Effingham, who, again, there is a kind of attraction there, but again, it is doomed because Violet Effingham has far more attraction for Lord Chiltern, who's a red-haired, fierce-tempered young nobleman who's always at odds with life. A lot of the people that know him think he should go into Parliament, but he himself would rather just ride to hounds all day. And another one of the women that take Phineas Finn into their orbit is Madame Goesler, who is a very wealthy widow, and who is in Phineas Finn sort of haltingly becoming friends with Lady Glencora in a way that Trollope is going to pursue just wonderfully, but not quite yet in that book. And in the course of that book, we get a lot of the political world of London at the time. We see Phineas Finn navigate that world, come to know its pitfalls, and also its glories. And there is there's a political climax to the book. There's a personal climax as well, but there's a political climax to the book that has the London political world fall out of love with Phineas Finn, and vice versa. The novel ends with him returning to Ireland and marrying the mousy little girl who he'd all but forgotten about when he was in the capital. And that's where Phineas Finn ends, but that's not where Anthony Trollope was done with Phineas Finn. Anthony Trollope had the dream of writing a kind of a fictional arc in its entirety of a political climber, of a political life. And just decided early on in proceedings that he would make the main character Irish for some reason instead of English. And hence, there wasn't ever any real doubt that he would return to Phineas Finn, and by extension, that Phineas Finn would return to politics. We had an interruption, if you want to put it that way. We had the third Palliser novel, which was a crime caper. It was a thriller. It was the affair of the Eustace diamonds, which had brought in a whole bunch of new characters. There was Lizzie Eustace and her fabulously valuable diamond necklace. There was Mr. Emilius, the slightly shady religious speaker. slightly shady and slightly charismatic. There was all the demi-monde of the world that Lizzie Eustace gathered around her. There was the man that she was trying to browbeat into marrying her, Lord Fawn, and a whole bunch of other people that suddenly took center stage in the book, sort of shunting to one side our normal cast of characters, our bigger cast of characters, the ones from Phineas Finn. So Phineas Finn, of course, wasn't in the book, but Lady Laura Standish, barely a mention. Lady Glencora in the book, but definitely a sidelined character. Same thing with Madame Max. Same thing with Plantagenet Palliser and with his uncle, the Duke of Omnium. And a whole bunch of other main characters that were sort of relegated to the sidelines while we went through the nevertheless absolutely enjoyable adventures and misadventures of Lizzie Eustace. And then that novel ends. It's a self-contained item. And then we launch in 1873, Trollope serialized, and then in 1874 came out as a novel, Phineas Finn, which I absolutely love this book. But I have to admit, I think it's the weakest of the Palliser novels as a novel on its own. There's virtually no way to read this thing and not feel left out without having read Phineas Finn, which is a detriment that really doesn't hold sway in the rest of the Palliser novels. I maintain that even, for instance, the remaining two Palliser novels are The Prime Minister and The Duke's Children. They are intimately connected novels, but you could easily read the one and not the other in either direction, and it would work just fine. Whereas Phineas Finn feels like, as you can tell from the title, again, it feels like a sequel. It is a sequel. And like most sequels, it starts with the author simply and rather unceremoniously getting rid of the stuff that will get in the way of his new story. And unfortunately, you can see this coming a mile away. Unfortunately, one of the main things that has to be gotten rid of is that mousy little Irish wife. She's gone. She's in a rather sadistic little turn on Trollope's part. She dies as a result of pregnancy complications. And Phineas Finn, we're told, is heartbroken. We're never shown it. He never seems to me to be grieving for his wife. He seems to me that, like, when you get halfway through this novel, if you walked up to him on the street in London and tapped his shoulders and asked him real quick to tell us what her given name was, he wouldn't be able to do it. But one way or another, that plus the death of his father puts him financially a tiny bit in a way. He has a salaried position in Ireland. In other words, he has a tiny bit of financial security, just enough to try to enter politics again. We are told that while he was in Ireland, a part of his soul was longing for the thrill of being at the heart of what Trollope considered the greatest job in the world. It's echoed. It's a sentiment that's echoed. We've seen it already. We may not have paid attention to it. We've seen it already in the Palliser novels, and we're going to see it again. It's echoed very clearly in the next two Palliser novels, when other characters are temporarily out of the world of politics. They're temporarily in the wilderness, as was the phrase applied to Winston Churchill, another lifelong politician. That when they're there, they long for the sound of trumpets. They long for the battle of the legislative life. And we are explicitly told that Phineas Finn is like that. It's another dodge on Trollope's part. He never stops dodging with this particular character. This is why I think that Phineas Finn himself is a bit of a failure in terms of a fictional creation. Phineas Finn acts on ambition, but he's the only person that in these two books, if we talk about the pair, Phineas Finn and Phineas Redux, if we talk about them as a pair, he's the only person in these two books who is entirely motivated by ambition, and yet who is not portrayed as ambitious. The other characters who are entirely motivated by ambition, we get the readerly thrill of knowing that Trollope, at least in some part, usually around 35%, disapproves of someone who's only motivated by ambition. In other words, we get to dislike those characters a little, but not Phineas Finn. No. And the same thing is true with his feckless lovemaking. When other characters do that, when other characters are gigolos, basically, That's what the introduction to this volume calls Phineas Finn, a political gigolo. I love that phrase. But it certainly applies. And when other of Trollope's characters in other books and even in this series are also gigolos in that way, they might have redeeming qualities, but they don't pull the wool over Trollope's eyes. He's the first in line to poke his kind of sharp-elbowed fun at them, but not Phineas Finn. Anyway, he tries his hand. Now, the one characteristic of Phineas Finn that you noticed in the first book, in the book called Phineas Finn, that everyone points out, is his luck, his unfailing luck. Even when it doesn't look like he's lucky at the time, he ends up being lucky. Even in the totally heartless calculus of a novel writer, the disappearance of that mousy little wife is about as lucky as such an incident can be. It allows Phineas Finn the perfect timing and the perfect way to get back into the heart and tussle of London politics. And he tries his hand to be elected to represent a town, Tankerville, a horrible, wonderfully described place. And he loses. And we think, oh, okay. Well, briefly, the window is opened on what could have been a far more interesting but far less enjoyable novel. But nope, his luck does not desert him. The election is contested, and it is determined that his opponent bribed some voters, and he gets in. So there you go. In very little time, very entertainingly done, but in very little time with very little fuss, Trollope has put Phineas Finn right back where we last saw him, right back where he was in the heart of the last novel in which he starred. Parliament. London. And he naturally, once he's back, makes the reacquaintance of all the people that he left. Lady Laura is miserable. Absolutely miserable. In fact, she's living apart from her husband. She's in Dresden. And he's still in Scotland. She views him as mad, as insane. Not just a horrible husband, not just a horribly manipulative and browbeating and overbearing husband, but also crazy. Violet Effingham is blissfully happy. She is blissfully happy. She is married and settled down and pregnant with Lord Chiltern. And it's not anywhere near the main plot of this book. It's not the secondary plot. It's not even the tertiary plot. But I have to say, and I'll be wondering what you think of all this, the portrait of the Chilterns here, the portrait of two people who are just teasingly, smartly, uncomplicatedly in love with each other, it sets off so much of what else is going on in this book. It's amazing to me. I noticed it more when I was reading. We're reading the first 20 chapters today, and I noticed it a lot more this time than I had the last time that I read this book. But in terms of the major and the secondary plots, one of the major plots is Phineas Finn returning to politics, and will there be conflict with his own party? Will he once again be brought up to a point where he has to decide whether he votes with his party or with his conscience? His party is a little leery of him. They had a rupture on that very point in the last book. And as a result of that, in London, he has enemies. There are people that don't trust him. There are people that think he's only lucky, and also maybe even a little insincere and conniving to play up to the sympathies of these powerfully political wives, these powerfully political women. One of those enemies is kind of in the background. He makes an enemy of an oily newspaper editor that we're going to see a lot of. He also makes an enemy of a man named Mr. Bonteen, who we're going to see a lot of in this book. But he also has friends. There's the greater part of London that is happy to see him, including, after an awkward reintroduction, Madame Max. There's every bit as much affection for him as she did before, and the plot line in which they deal with each other is complicated and thoroughly adult right from the beginning, and just gets better as it goes along. So tremendous. And also, there's Lady Glencora, who is much more in this book than she was, of course, in the Eustace Diamonds. And also there's her husband, Plantagenet Palliser, and the old Duke of Omnium, who in this book is dying. He in the last time that we saw him in the Eustace Diamonds, he was not quite an invalid, but he was definitely not. He was definitely leaving life. It was just he was leaving it slowly and comfortably. And in the Eustace Diamonds and in Phineas Finn, we see the beginnings of a very complicated relationship between the old Duke of Omnium and Madame Max. If the old Duke had his way, their relationship would not be complicated. It would be very simple. His original proposal, he never has quite the courage to state it openly, but his original proposal is that she be his mistress, even though he's 80 million years old. And then, as time passes, his second proposal is that she be his wife, that she be his duchess. She refuses, but it doesn't change anything. Their relationship continues to grow. I don't know quite what was on Trollope's mind with that relationship. We're going to see a lot of it in this book, though, one way or another, because she's a steadfast friend, as she tells Phineas Finn when he questions her on the subject in the chapters that we're reading today. She tells him, well, actually, let me read you what she tells him. She talks about what the old Duke is like. And we've seen a passage like this before. There was a passage like this in Phineas Finn, and Trollope decides just to give it to us again. They're talking about the old Duke, who's not anything like his nephew. His nephew works all day long at the Treasury, and the old Duke is just the Duke of Omnium. That's all he is. And that's all he needs to be, is the very strong implication. Phineas Finn is all aflame with social responsibility. And he says, a man with his wealth and rank has opportunities so great. Look at what his nephew does. Look at his nephew. And she says, no doubt Mr. Palliser is a great man, referring to Plantagenet Palliser. He never has a moment to speak to his wife or to anybody else, and is always thinking so much about the country that I doubt if he knows anything about his own affairs. Of course, he is a man of different stamp, and of a higher stamp, if you will. But I have an idea that such characters as those of the present Duke are necessary to the maintenance of a great aristocracy. He has had the power of making the world believe in him simply because he has been rich and a duke. His nephew, when he comes to the title, will never receive a tithe of the respect paid to this old fainéant. Which is entirely true, but still, you wonder what's on her mind when it comes to stuff like that. But anyway, we get that Phineas's introduction into the political world is the main point of the 20 chapters that we're reading today. That we get, it's not much of a plot right there. The readers coming to this thinking, okay, well, I remember the chapter by chapter exciting revelations of the Eustace Diamonds. This is a decided drop down in speed. Those readers are going to get their plot. Oh, believe you me, if you're reading this book and you don't know anything about it, and you're thinking, oh, it's going to be long parliamentary chapters for the whole of the book. No, no, it's not. A couple of things happen. Not in these first 20 chapters, but a couple of things definitely happen. You're not going to want for plot. There's another plot, a comic plot, a comic side plot, which is always a treat in Trollope. You want to watch for those because they're always so much fun. Adelaide Palliser, a young woman who is a part of the family, a distant cousin to, first cousin, I think, to Plantagenet Palliser, not having grown up in the heart of the splendor of the Pallisers and having no fortune, has suitors. She has one suitor in particular, a marvelous Trollope comic character called Mr. Spoon or Spoon Hall. He's just a little bit over 40, but he might as well be 80 as far as Adelaide Palliser is concerned. And he owns his own home. He has no debts. The Spooners have been at Spoon Hall for 4 generations, and he wants her to marry him. Would you be my wife? And she's horrified at the idea, absolutely horrified. Her rejection of him when he first asked her is so emphatic that it insults him. And there's another man who's hanging around the Palliser world called Gerald Maule, who doesn't have anything particular to recommend him, doesn't have a penny to his name, he's in debt, he's always keeping hunting horses and swanning all around without any real income. But he's definitely charming. He definitely has something that Spooner of Spoon Hall does not. And the Adelaide Palliser plot line sort of percolates along in the book. Trollope never puts a whole lot of weight on it, never more weight than it can withstand, which he sometimes does with his comic subplots. Sometimes he thinks, we've seen it already in our Trollope read-alongs at least once. Sometimes he thinks that those comic subplots are more interesting than they really are, and he gives them puts a little more weight on them than he should. Not with Adelaide Palliser. But the first 20 chapters of this book is really us just coming back into the world of Phineas Finn, which we had demonstrably left when we were reading the Eustace Diamonds. And that's where I want to wrap things up for now, because I'm mainly curious to know what your own reactions are to that. I every time I reread this book, my feeling about it is exactly the same. I don't want to prejudice your feelings, but every time I come to this book, I feel such an incredible smile on the inside to be returning to these old friends, to these characters who mean more to me than 90% of the characters who showed up in the Eustace Diamonds and took over the plot, if that makes any sense. I want to know about what's going on with Madame Max and with Violet Effingham and with poor doomed Lady Laura and with Mr. Kennedy and the old Duke and Plantagenet Palliser and Lady Glencora. I want to know what's happening with these people more than I want to know about a lawyer named Mr. Camperdown and how determined he is that an heirloom is not an heirloom. I mean, it's not. I'm not running down the Eustace Times. I had a blast rereading it. I always love reading it, but I think you can tell when Trollope's heart is the extent to which his heart is in the characters that he creates, and I think this cast of characters moves him, pleases him even more than the characters in the Barsetshire novels. I think these are the people. These are his people, a few in particular, and that's where I want to wrap this up for today. We are finished with the first 20 chapters, and they basically serve to reintroduce us to everyone and set the stage for the rest of the novel. And I want to know what you thought of that. Did it feel like returning to old friends, or would you have been perfectly happy to have another adventure story, another thriller? But one way or another, we're gonna stop here, and we're going to. Next week, we'll read the next 20 pages, or the next 20 chapters. So we will go to, what will we be? Chapter 40. So we'll go from Phineas again in London to the Prime Minister is hard pressed. And those will be our 20 chapters for next weekend. So let me know in the comments field what you thought of these first 20 chapters. And also, as a nosy side note, because you know that I want to know these things, if you feel free to let me know how you're reading this book. Are you doing it with an electronic copy from Project Gutenberg? Are you doing it with an Oxford trade paperback, a Penguin paperback? Did you maybe find an old Dover trade paperback or whatever, a hardcover from the library? I'd love to hear all that too. All of that is fascinating to me. But anyway, that is our read along for today. We'll be back next Sunday with part 2 of Phineas Redux. In the meantime, I will see you soon. Thank you, Book 2.